Hello and welcome back to Japan Memo, the IISS Japan Chair Programme podcast. I'm Robert Ward, Japan Chair and Director of Geoeconomics and Strategy here at the IISS. In this podcast, we're joined by experts, strategists and practitioners to analyse why Japan matters in today's regional and global geopolitical landscape. Today, we're privileged to be able to welcome three distinguished guests, Dr. Chijiwa Yasuaki, Dr. Jennifer Lint, and Dr. Sayuri Romei, to discuss Japan's post-war defence policy in light of the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II, which falls on August 15th. Before we get into the discussion, I'd like to introduce our wonderful guests. Dr. Chijiwa Yasuaki is Chief at the International Conflict Division at the National Institute for Defence Studies, NIDS, in Japan, which is affiliated with the Ministry of Defence in Japan. Yasuaki's research interests include Japan's post-war defence policy. He's widely published in English as well as in Japanese. I can particularly recommend his Sengo Nihon no Anzen Hosho, which I think translates as Japan's post-war security, which was published in 2022. The book contains fascinating analysis, particularly I found, of Japan's National Security Council. A great read. Yasuaki has won a number of awards, including the 7th Inoki Masamichi Award of the Japan Association for Defence Studies and the 43rd Ishibashi Tanzan Award. A warm welcome, Yasuaki.
Thank you.
And our second speaker is Dr. Jennifer Lint. Jennifer is an associate professor in the Department of Government at Dartmouth College in the US and an expert in East Asian international relations. Jennifer is also affiliated with the Reischauer Institute of Japanese Studies at Harvard University, as well as with Chatham House in London. She's the author of a forthcoming book published towards the end of the year called Autocracy 2.0, How China's Rise Transformed Tyranny, published by Cornell, which looks at China's rise and its smart authoritarianism. She's also the author of Sorry States, Apologies in International Politics, which was published in 2008. Jennifer has published numerous scholarly articles about issues related to East Asia and writes for wider audiences in outlets such as Foreign Affairs and the New York Times. A warm welcome, Jennifer.
Thank you so much.
And our third speaker is Dr. Sayuri Romei, who is a senior fellow in the German Marshall Fund, GMF, Indo-Pacific program. Sayuri leads work on Japan and heads the GMF's Japan Trilateral Forum. Sayuri's research focuses on US-Japan relations and security issues in the Indo-Pacific. She was previously an associate director of programs at the Maureen and Mike Mansfield Foundation, where she was responsible for the next generation of US-Japan Nuclear Experts Program. She was also a Stanton Nuclear Security Fellow at the RAND Corporation, Fellow for Security and Foreign Affairs at Sasakawa Peace Foundation, USA, and a MacArthur Nuclear Security Fellow at Stanford University's Center for International Security and Cooperation. A warm welcome to you, Sayuri, as well.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
If we start the discussion by looking at the development of Japan's post-war defense policy, after the end of World War II, Japan adopted defensive defense doctrine, according to which its military could be configured for self-defense and should avoid offensive capabilities and missions. The doctrine also established clear constraints on Japan's defense spending and power projection, as well as allowing Japan to rebuild its shattered economy. This policy also reflected, of course, Japan's sensitivity to the legacy in the region of its wartime behavior. However, in response to the increasingly challenging security environment and heightened expectations from allies, notably the US, of course, Japan has been evolving pretty rapidly its national security policies, which included reinterpretation of constitutional constraints on collective self-defense in 2015. And the revision later of its three principles on arms exports. So Japan's travelled quite a long way in how it thinks about its defence and security over the past 80 years. So question to all three of you, how do you assess this evolution of Japan's post-war national security policy? Perhaps, Yasuaki, we can start with you as you're sitting in Tokyo at the moment.
Thank you for your question, Dr. Watt. I would like to pay attention to especially the formulation of 2022 three security document by Kishida Fumio administration as evolution of Japan's post-war national security policy. The three security documents are first produced in 2013 during the second Abe Shinzo administration. The National Defense Program Guideline, today's National Defense Strategy, and the Medium-Term Defense Program, today's Defense Build-Up Program, were revised in 2018. But the 2022 revision is the first time that the three documents have been revised at the same time. we can understand that the three documents are not initially compiled as a three-piece set. Certainly, we had the basic policy on national defense from 1957 to 2013, but it had become a dead letter policy. So aside from the basic policy on national defense, there had originally only the National Defense Program Guidelines as one document, which was first developed in 1976 during the Miki Takeo administration period. And 9 years later, during the Nakasone Yasuhiro administration period, the medium-term defense program was created under the National Defense Program Guideline in 1985. And 28 years later, in 2013, the National Security Strategy was formulated. Thus, finally, the three documents appeared. The main focus of Japanese national security policy during the Cold War was to promote progressive defense build-up under Japan-US security arrangement. There was little need for Japan to dare to mention national security strategy, as conversely, using words such as strategy risked being branded as a revival of militarism. However, in response to an increasingly challenging security environment and the long-term trend of the retreat of U.S. foreign engagement, it became necessary for Japan to not simply be passive with a focus on defense build-up, but to actively exercise influence in an attempt to create an international order that is desirable for Japan and the world. As a guideline for this purpose, the National Security Strategy was formulated with the philosophy of proactive contribution to peace. The purpose of the revision of the three documents is clarify the responsibility of Japan itself. The National Security Strategy specifies the primary responsibility for defending Japan lies with itself. In fact, the National Security Strategy states that the National Security Strategy will dramatically transform Japan's national security policy after the end of World War II from the aspect of its execution. This includes holding counter-strike capabilities, which we have not had before, and increasing the defense budget to 2% of GDP.
Thank you. That was a nice framing tour through the last 80 years of Japan's defense thinking. And I was particularly struck by what you said, Japan not needing to have a national security strategy in the Cold War. And obviously that's now changed quite significantly. Jennifer, how do you view within that context the last sort of 80 years in Japan's defense evolution?
I would say that we see an interplay between dynamics related to the US-Japan alliance and factors in Japan's threat environment. Of course, domestic politics in Japan has also played a role, but essentially, as we've watched Japan's evolution over the past several decades, we can see the influence of these factors, these kind of key moving parts. So at times when Japan's threat environment was low and the faith in the US-Japan alliance was high, then Japan was able to be quite restrained, to not have this issue of sending troops overseas, acquiring capabilities, and so on. Those issues just didn't really surface very much. There were people in the LDP who were interested in a more Gaullist foreign policy, as Dick Samuels has referred to it, a more independent, a more muscular security policy. But generally, those voices remain quite minor. At other times, you would see that the threat environment would grow more serious, or also that there would be doubts about the US-Japan alliance, or simply that the US side was saying to Japan, you must do more. And so an example of this would be the 1980s, for example, the late 1970s, 1980s, when the Soviet Union was doing a major military buildup in East Asia. So, of course, for most of the Cold War, the Soviet threat was focused on Europe. And so the threat to Japan was relatively low. But during that time, during the late 70s, the Soviets began a big military buildup. And of course, this is in the kind of post-Nixon doctrine era when the United States was telling Japan it needed to do more. There were doubts about the extent to which the United States would support Japanese defense and so on. So that was sort of the perfect storm of a raised threat environment, feelings of insecurity within the alliance, And indeed, when you look at Japan's security evolution, you see during that time a pretty extraordinary push in terms of the capabilities that Japan was acquiring and the roles that it was willing to take on within the alliance. If you look at those factors today, I think you can see similar dynamics going on. You have a very serious threat environment facing Japan. You have a superpower neighbor, a proximate superpower that claims territory that the Japanese say that they own. We have essentially another superpower competition, but this time it's in Japan's own neighborhood. And that is a very serious difference between the Cold War and today. And so it's just not remotely surprising that the Japanese are feeling an increased threat from that. And then with respect to the US-Japan alliance, we see what had formerly been sort of for the past 30 years, just sort of an accepted grand strategy that the United States was going to be a global leader and continue to have these security alliances in which it exercised most of the military spending and most of the military power and so on. We see the electorate has chosen a candidate twice now that doesn't favor that kind of a strategy and favors a more nationalist approach. And so this has raised questions about the US-Japan alliance at a time which, as I said, is a heightened threat to Japan. Unsurprisingly, again, given these dynamics, and then also we can talk about the abandonment of the Japanese left, right, which had been the restraining force in Japan for many years. These are all the factors that are causing Japan to feel quite threatened and to move in a more assertive direction in terms of its security policy.
Your point, Jennifer, about the superpower competition being in Japan's own neighborhood. I was thinking the other day about the G7, and no other G7 country has the degree of threat in physical proximity as Japan does. So you've got Russia in the north and North Korea in the middle, and then China obviously in the south. So it's quite unique. And your point on the abandonment of the Japanese left, that was in evidence in the upper house election in the middle of July. There was a lot of focus on the right and the developments there, but less focus on the, as you say, the withering of the left there. So thank you, Jennifer. Sayuri, your thoughts on the evolution?
First of all, I do agree with Jennifer that the US-Japan alliance and the changes in the security environment of Japan, those are two big factors of how Japan's security policy has evolved over time. I think Japan's security policy has undergone an evolution over time. There have been major milestones, but I see these changes more as an adjustments rather than big breaks from the past. A lot of my Japanese colleagues always say it's an evolution more than a revolution, and I think that's right. So that implies that Japan has been going through a recalibration of some sort as the country has been responding to these pressing changes in the security environment. And as you mentioned, Robert, Japan lives in a very, very dangerous neighborhood. The Japanese government made these changes to its security policy incrementally, but also at the same time, a lot of it is concentrated in the last 15 years. There was a flurry of activities. And that's also probably why some see it as a sudden break from the post-war defensive defense doctrine. For example, we see in the media sometimes that Japan broke from its pacifist identity and it's turning more into a militaristic power sort of narrative. These changes simply reflect Japan's growing awareness that it needs to keep up with the new security challenges. But it also underscores its growing willingness and ability to proactively contribute to the US-Japan alliance.
A quick follow-up question, Sayuri. You said that obviously the policy change has really been concentrated in the last 15 years. Presumably you're talking about from 2012 onwards to now, Abe's return to power. From what you say, I'm inferring that you think that Abe's flurry of activity, that was obviously concentrated activity, but that was also evolution from before, or was that a step change in your view?
I think it was evolution. I think at the time, the Japanese public was probably not really in touch with these security changes in the environment. That's where the clash happened. Abe had his own thoughts and was very conservative. Unlike what many people in Washington think, Abe was very conservative. Anything that he said on security and defense matters was also seen as suspicious by the general public at the time. More and more, I think, thanks to the media as well and the way security experts started to explain these security issues to the general public, I think there has been a little bit of an adjustment, and the gap between the general public, the knowledge of the security issues, and the Japanese government was diminished. And maybe that's also why in 2022, when there were lots of revisions on the defense policy, we didn't really see many protests among the public. I think that still constitutes an evolution.
One of the eye-catching things that caught a lot of foreign eyes in the 2022 National Security Strategy, the plan to boost defence spending from this sort of informal cap of 1% to 2%, and actually give a timeline for this, which I thought was particularly striking, financial year 2027. Just to put some numbers on this for our listeners, if Japan does achieve this increase to 2% of GDP on defence spending from the 1% that has been this informal cap for some decades, that would take it, I think, defence spending to around $80 billion a year, which would put Japan, I think, either third or fourth largest defence spender in the world, which would obviously be quite an undertaking. So quite an amazing change, although it does fall short of Trump's desire for 5%. In Shangri-La Dialogue, Pete Hegseth, the US Defense Secretary, was asking for 5% of GDP from the Allies, which obviously caused a bit of worry amongst some of the audience. But Yasuaki, this threshold of 1%, which had held for so long, it's already been broken. I think defense spending is higher already than 1% and on its way to where it needs to be. What does this imply for Japan's view of its defense and security? Can you tell us anything about sort of broader meaning of what this increase in defense spending carries with it?
2022 medium-term defense program presents a defense budget of 43 trillion yen, $280 billion, which is about 1.6 times the amount of previous medium-term defense programs. The background, the increase of defense spending is, I think, the change of defense concept itself. Until now, several defense concepts have been proposed. When the three documents were formulated in 2013, the National Defense Program Guideline proposed the idea of dynamic joint defense force as a form of defense capability. This was aimed at building a defense capability with more through implementation of the idea of joint operations of ground, maritime, and air self-defense forces to be carried out seamlessly and dynamically, adapting to situations as they demand. The dynamic joint defense force was upgraded to the multi-domain defense force in the 2018 National Defense Program Guideline to support new domains such as space, cyber, and electromagnetic waves. And it is necessary to increase the defense budget to support these defense concepts. By the way, be it a dynamic joint defense force or a multi-domain defense force, the defense concept is in the same vein. Simply put, it is a counter-threat and operation-oriented policy. The former National Defense Program Guideline has long advocated the basic defense force concept from 1976 to 2010. The basic defense force concept is based on the beyond the threat theory, which does not assume specific threats for the defense build-up. This is the antithesis of the required defense force, that is a counter-threat theory. A 5-year defense build-up plan from the first defense build-up plan in 1957 to the fourth defense build-up plan in 1972 adopted counter-threat theory. It shifted to the National Defense Program Guideline after the fourth plan, and at the same time of formulation 1976 National Defense Program Guideline, the 1% cap of GNP set. Another characteristic of the defense concept in post-war Japan is that the defense build-up has been emphasized while operations had been secondary. Japan had a history of being disarmed after defeating World War II and then undergoing rearmament. Primarily, we had devoted ourselves to defense build-up. Therefore, there had been a tendency toward defense build-up for the sake of defense build-up concept that is of a different dimension from operation. For example, the basic defense force concept aimed at repelling the limited and small-scale aggression without external assistance. The concept of repelling the limited and small-scale aggression without external assistance was not operational concept, but logic for defense build-up. The defense agency at that time should make a situation which self-defense forces repelled aggression without US help to negotiate with the Ministry of Finance and get a budget. By contrast, in recent years, emphasis had been placed on the issue of what kind of defense capability is necessary for operations. The seed of this was a multifunctional, flexible, and effective defense force that the National Defense Program Guideline advocated in 2004. The background is that defense build-up had progressed under the National Defense Program Guideline since 1976, and the cooperation between the self-defense forces and the U.S. military deepened. Then in 2010, the National Defense Program Guideline proposed a departure from the basic defense force concept and the idea of a dynamic defense force to replace it. So in other words, we will gradually shift from a basic defense force concept centered on beyond the threat and emphasis on defense build-up to the concept of counter-threat and emphasis on operation, which may be understood as an upgrade along the lines of multifunctional, flexible, and effective defense force and dynamic defense force, dynamic joint defense force to today's multi-domain defense force.
Jennifer, Yasuaki said the concept has moved to counter-threat and emphasis on operations, which is quite a big shift, again, assuming no particular threat that prevailed for many of the years after the Second World War. You sort of hinted at some of the things that were going on in Japan's near abroad. Could you flesh out for our listeners what's driving this need to spend more money in Japan on defense?
Japan really does face a serious threat environment. There's obviously the rise of China, which is a superpower, the largest economy in the world. It's been engaged in a multi-decade conventional military buildup. It's now engaging in a major nuclear modernization that's taking it from having a very minimum deterrent kind of a nuclear force to basically a nuclear peer of the United States and Russia. This is a country that claims parts of territory that, again, Japan says is Japanese territory. And it's also a country, or I should say it's a regime, that uses anti-Japanese propaganda as a core part of its domestic legitimacy. And so this is really serious, right? This checks all the boxes when you're looking at the definition of a threat from one country to another. China is doing all of the things. It's rallying its population to hate Japan. It's claiming Japanese territory. It's building up its military power. All of these things are behaviors that are deeply threatening in international politics. The rise of this kind of a superpower right in Japan's backyard is a very, very dangerous situation for Japan. The other threats that Japan faces, I would say, are much different, much less severe, but still serious, obviously. So Japan has historically poor relations with Russia, and we see Russian resurgence. So far, Russia has been focused on Europe. I don't think Russia is going to have adventurism in East Asia because it's simply either not going to have the interest or it's just not going to have the capability, given how worn down by the Ukraine war it is. But still, again, we're talking about added context about this dangerous neighborhood that Japan lives in. And of course, there's the North Korean threat. North Korea is another country that, to a degree even more dramatic than China, has inculcated in its people a deep hatred of Japan and deep resentment based on historical memory. North Korea, their government routinely talks about launching missiles at Japan and so on. North Korea's own nuclear force has grown significantly, and the threat of a war on the Korean Peninsula is always with us. This is a quite dangerous threat environment, and particularly it's the superpower threat that I would say has most galvanized the Japanese to feel the kind of threat perception that we're seeing in recent years.
In your forthcoming book, Autocracy 2.0, is there anything from what you wrote about that you think Japanese policymakers should be aware of regarding China that perhaps they're not? Or do you think that Japan's got a pretty good understanding of the specific threat from China?
There are two things that I would emphasize from the book project. The book is out in November, so I'm excited to talk to folks about it, hopefully IISS. The first argument that I make is that China has become one of the most technologically innovative countries in the world. Remember, we didn't think this could happen. There were many people who said China is a copycat, it's not an innovator. They would also point to China's authoritarian institutions as why they didn't think China could ever be in the same league as the world's most innovative countries, such as Japan, such as Britain, such as South Korea, the US, and so on. Lesson number one is, guess what? China has become one of the most technologically innovative countries in the world, which obviously, if you're in a security competition with that country, that's very bad news. We much prefer the scenario in which we think that China is not very good at making things and is just going to copy things, because then we could, as we've tried in the US, we could cut off China's access to Western technology and China would sort of crumble. But that's not what we're seeing. I guess the other point that I would raise from the book is that we have had the view that autocracies are inferior to democracies in many ways, less competent than democracies in many ways. And I think that this has been wishful thinking and also hubris on the part of we democracies in the West, the United States. I'm including Japan here in this strange concept of West that we have, certainly Britain. Again, the idea that because our institutions are so superior and because autocracies, the way that they run themselves, don't lend themselves to innovation, I think we felt very complacent about the threat that authoritarian countries represented to our way of life, to the construct of international order, and so on. So essentially, what I'm saying in the book is China is technologically quite competent. It's made itself technologically quite formidable, which obviously has huge economic as well as military implications. And then also in this broader competition between democracies and authoritarian countries, we need to worry about the fact that authoritarian countries have adopted smarter policies. I call it smart authoritarianism relative to the more ham-fisted authoritarians of the past, where they can actually pursue the policies to inculcate innovation by sending their people abroad and by allowing them those and other kinds of freedoms that allow them to innovate and so on. The book is a warning about the Chinese superpower, the challenge that the US, Japan, Britain, others are facing here in this narrow security competition. It's a broader warning about the competence in some authoritarian countries that we need to be aware of.
Thank you, Jennifer, for that. We talked a bit about public opinion, and I was in Japan when the 2022 National Security Strategy came out and the documents, other two documents. And I was sort of braced for big reaction like happened in 2015 with the constitutional reinterpretation, but it was all very quiet. Sayuri, you were talking about that sort of the way public opinion sort of moved on. I'd be interested to hear your views on whether you think that this shift in public opinion is now entrenched and whether that's going to be a sort of tailwind for the other things that the Japanese government needs to do with regards to sort of shifting Japan's defense posture.
Sure. May I add one thing from the previous question? One thing that Jennifer mentioned, and I think it needs to be expanded a little bit. It's the Russia's invasion of Ukraine as a watershed moment. Jennifer mentioned Russia as a revisionist power and the revival of Russian power. we really need to pinpoint the invasion of Ukraine in 2022 as a watershed moment for Japan's defense policy as well, because it really sent a powerful shock to the Japanese government and the Japanese public. And the Japanese government, right up in the days leading up to the invasion, was not believing that the invasion was going to happen. So it was really a very big shock. And one of Japan's main national interests is to preserve the liberal international order through the rule of law. And so Russia's aggression clearly showed that this core interest of Japan's security policy was in real danger. And I think that's also a very powerful driver of the changes in defense policy in 2022. That's also why the 2022 National Security Strategy also has more explicit wording on China compared to the past. The fact that Prime Minister Kishida was constantly trying to link the Indo-Pacific theater with the European theater made a difference in this. Public opinion in Japan has been changing very slowly for decades, but I would say that in the last 8 years or so, and especially since the war in Ukraine in 2022, I think it has evolved more in favor of a stronger defense policy for Japan. We can see some surveys from 2008. Japanese respondents overwhelmingly indicated the abductees as their main concern about North Korea. Now things are very different. They're thinking about a missile program, nuclear program. Same for Japan's view on China. The portion of the Japanese public that was favorable to China dropped considerably in just a few years in this around the same time frame. Public opinion can also change very suddenly and temporarily whenever there are international incidents that involve Japanese citizens. For example, in 2006, Russian Coast Guards killed a Japanese fisherman when his boat entered the waters near the disputed islands in the Northern Territories. And in the annual survey on public interest in security and defense, which took place right after this incident, there was a big surge in support towards a beefed up defense policy. If you look at another data from the Cabinet Office's annual survey, you can also see that 2021 marks a big increase among Japanese people about their interest in security and defense matters. It could be that in those years, there was a lot of media coverage on China's aggressive military behavior. There was a researcher from the National Institute for Defense Studies, NIDS, for example, that was very frequently on national TV explaining the Chinese threat in detail, discussing security issues in East Asia, why it is important to deter China. And that had never really happened before. But since 2020, 2021, those appearances were very frequent on TV. So I think the Japanese public might have been influenced by that. The other important piece is what I mentioned earlier is Russia's aggression of Ukraine. It was felt enormously by the Japanese public. In the past, Japanese government officials often complained that the Japanese public was oblivious to imminent security threats and that it was only interested in peace, whatever that means, and its pacifist legacy. But I believe that in recent years, this gap has diminished. However, I want to add that although Japan is a relatively small country in a very dangerous neighborhood, just like in many other countries, including the US, the priorities for Japanese voters are not really focused on security, foreign affairs. They are still focused on domestic issues. Defense, foreign affairs, international relations, these are still not priority for the average Japanese. That means that the public will be watching the debate on the tax increase plan to support increased defense spending. And with today's unpredictable aspects injected in the global economy, I think it will be very interesting to see how the current public support for the 2022 policy changes, as you mentioned, or maybe lack of protests, how that will evolve over time. depending on these domestic issues that are closer to the average voter.
Yasuaki, this shift that Sayuri's been talking about in terms of public opinion, does this have an influence in your view on political decision making within Japan on mapping out defense priorities?
1976 National Defense Program Guideline adopted the Beyond the Threat Theory, a basic defense force concept. The background was public opinion at the time. The reason why the Beyond the Threat Theory was picked up was the emphasis on building a public consensus on defense policy at the time. The first National Defense Program Guideline was formulated in 1976 in an era of detente despite the Cold War. At that time, Japanese public opinion over defense policy was seriously divided. Largest opposition party, Japanese Socialist Party, insisted Japan's unarmed neutrality. The Japanese government thought that the basic defense force concept based on the Beyond the Threat Theory could get understanding from the public opinion. So today, on the other hand, the era of Beyond the Threat Theory was terminated. The reason was, I think, the change of security environment surrounding Japan, as Dr. Lind and Dr. Romei mentioned. So public polls showed the high public support for strengthening defense capabilities. So this is becoming the new consensus and help the judgment of a defense policy maker. So times passed, and it can be said that the time has come to overcome the legacy of the past.
Just look very quickly now at Japan's security alliance with the US, which in all the government's documents says this is the cornerstone of Japanese defense policy, also by implication a support foundation for foreign policy as well. And the relations since the security treaty was signed in 1951 and then revised in 1960, particularly from the 90s onwards, the relations within the security treaty between Japan and the US have been getting closer. I'd like to sort of hear your thoughts really on the evolution of this alliance, which is obviously special in so many ways and vital for Japan. Jennifer, can I get your thoughts on this important alliance for Japan?
It's a really remarkable alliance with a really remarkable evolution when you think about it. When the alliance began, it was a very narrow phenomenon. It was an alliance between governments. It was quite narrow. There was the LDP and particularly the pro-American faction of the LDP. And it was the United States government really deciding, because of the Cold War, this is an advantageous situation, so we're going to come together. And the reason this was extraordinary is because, again, Japan and the United States had just fought this unbelievably bitter and brutal war against one another. And the two societies really viewed each other with so much hostility at the time. The governments really brute forced this alliance, this security relationship into occurring. One very important change, I think, really started with the 1960 protest movement in Japan, with the change in an effort to make this alliance more between peoples and countries rather than just these narrow governments with their security priorities. The officials on both sides saw in the security treaty protests in Japan how much resentment there was about the alliance, how much fear there was, given that it created a serious risk of entrapment for Japan in the nuclear crises of the Cold War. The leaders at the time said, we have to do something to make this alliance appealing to people in both of our countries. I think they succeeded tremendously. They created numerous institutions, numerous programs. They invested in cadres of alliance managers, which we see generations of those over time. That was a very important change, again, in bringing us to where we are today, which is a profound level of warmth between these two societies and tremendous value among the people of both societies, that we have something very special here, that these are countries that share security interests, absolutely, but also that we want good things for each other. We like it when the other is prospering. We think that it's good for us, good for them, good for the world. That's a really remarkable change from the days of distrust and resentment that this alliance emerged out of.
Yasuaki, the US-Japan alliance, where's it come from and where's it going to go? We sort of touched lightly on the uncertainties of how the US views the world since Donald Trump returned to office.
2022 three-stage documents emphasize the joint deterrence and response by the Japan-US alliance. So in particular, I'd like to pick up the significance of the establishment of a Joint Operations Command, or the JJOC, on Japanese side. 2022 National Defense Strategy stated that in order to reinforce the effective joint operational posture, Japan will establish a permanent joint headquarters, which can unify command of ground, maritime, and air self-defense forces. The JJOC was established within the Ministry of Defense in Ichigaya, Tokyo, in March 2025. Japan-US joint leaders statement between Prime Minister Kishida and President Biden in 2024 referred the significance of the establishment of the JJOC for the Japan-US alliance as to bilaterally upgrade our respective command and control frameworks to enable seamless integration of operations and capabilities and allow for greater interoperability and planning between US and Japanese forces at peacetime and during the contingencies. So July 2024, US-Japan Security Consultative Committee 2+2 meeting also discussed improving the command and control framework, with the US side expressing its intention to restructure US forces in Japan into a joint military headquarters under the command of the Indo-Pacific Command and the importance of the JJOC as its counterpart. Regarding the coordination of command between Japan and the United States, a parallel command system was adopted in the guidelines for US-Japan Defense Cooperation formulated in 1978. A parallel command system differed from the combined command system like the US-South Korea alliance. President Sherman Lee, during the Korean War in 1950, transferred his command over Korean military to the UN commander, General Douglas MacArthur. Guidelines revised in 2015 also stipulated the self-defense forces in the US armed forces in close cooperation and coordination will take action through their respective chains of command. In fact, before then, while emphasis is placed on separating command of self-defense force from the US, there was not been sufficient consideration given to how self-defense forces and the US military should cooperate under such a parallel command system. This situation changed after the end of the Cold War. The 1997 guidelines provided for the establishment of a Japan-US Bilateral Coordination Center. The subsequent 2015 guidelines stipulated the establishment of an Alliance Coordination Mechanism, or ACM. So in this way, the command coordination between Japan and the United States in recent years have developed with the aim of facilitating information sharing and policy or operation coordination for effective Japan-US joint response and a parallel system. The establishment of the JJOC can be seen as furthering these trends that have continued since the 1997 guidelines.
So the trend towards Japan and the US sort of moving more closely together within the alliance. Sayuri, your thoughts, please, on this pivotal relationship for Japan.
First of all, I want to echo Jennifer in saying that it's really the people-to-people ties that make the alliance between the US and Japan. At first, it was just between governments. Now it has so many other aspects. And when I talk to my Japan hands friends, it's always very cheerful and lively. I heard from the experts in the US-China community. Their community is very different, of course. The people-to-people ties, the exchange programs that really make this alliance what it is now. And it's so strong. We have a lot of good Japan hands here in the US. That's something that's lacking in Europe, where I come from. We've already talked about the 2022 turning point, but I also want to talk a little bit about two points in time that are important for the alliance. The 2013-2015 timeframe, it gave a lot of clarity on Japan's defense posture and trajectory. shaped Japan's security policy as we know it today. The revised guidelines really strengthened the interoperability between the two militaries, the US and Japan. It made it possible for them to plan for a greater range of crises. That time frame also coincides with Xi Jinping's rise to power in China, who reoriented Beijing's strategic focus on security more than economy. So I think that time frame is really important for the development of the US-Japan alliance. And I think the early 2000s also deserves some attention in response to President George W. Bush's war on terror. Prime Minister Koizumi in Japan quickly passed special legislation to dispatch the Maritime Self-Defense Force in support of Operation Enduring Freedom, which was a very different approach from the Gulf War, where Japan only used financial means to support the operations. That is a period, the early 2000s, that represented the beginning of the deepening of the US-Japan alliance on the defense level, and it really served as a springboard for a lot of the subsequent decisions for security policy that we talked about.
Staying with you, Sayuri, if I may, we're recording on August 6th, so the 80th anniversary of the dropping of the bomb on Hiroshima, and then August the 9th for Nagasaki. So obviously a lot of sort of focus on nuclear weapons, and particularly given the issues, Russia's attack on Ukraine and the threats that they've made. One question that I get asked is Japan going to reconsider acquiring its own nuclear weapons? I was asked that only yesterday by a newspaper. You've done some work on this. Do you think that this is likely or possible, or is there any debate within Japan that you're following on changing of thinking?
And that's a classic debate, and it's been around for decades and decades. And I know that because South Korea in recent years has this resurgence of this debate on nuclearization. In South Korea, it's really lively. It's very alive, the debate. Many here in the US, but also in Europe, think, will Japan follow suit? The short answer is, I don't think so. I believe that the Japanese government understands very well that acquiring nuclear weapons is the worst policy choice. And it just has so many hurdles, technological to financial to, of course, public opinion, international repercussions with Japan's image it has put forward for so long, and especially in the last 10 years about how Japan is more of a proactive, friendly international player who wants to preserve the liberal international order, rule of law. All of these things would be completely wiped away. There are just so many hurdles to pull that off. I don't think it would work. And I do believe that the Japanese government and many in the security community, they all know that that would be just a really terrible choice. However, in July of last year, we saw Japan and the United States hold their first ever ministerial talks on extended deterrence in Tokyo during this so-called 2+2 meeting. That's a welcome development in terms of upgrading the extended deterrence dialogue. It was about time that the two allies issued those guidelines for extended deterrence since their first extended deterrence dialogue back in 2010. What I'm trying to say is that Japan is definitely going to keep the US nuclear umbrella. It's not going anywhere. But I want to point out that there has been an evolution in Japan's nuclear thinking as well. Since 2010, since the beginning of this extended deterrence dialogue, I think Japan has gone a really long way in terms of deterrence fluency. At first, the extended deterrence dialogue meetings I hear were mainly about the US side teaching the Japanese and explaining what extended deterrence is and what the US nuclear policy and things like that. But since then, Japan has become extremely well versed in deterrence matters. So Japan really has produced a lot of knowledgeable security experts who specifically work on nuclear issues. And that happened pretty quickly, I would say. But I know that there are still not that many. A lot of them are in the government. I know that these bilateral meetings are much more fruitful now because there are simulations and discussions productive site visits. There are many more security experts in the Japanese government and around the Japanese government who can talk about deterrence and nuclear issues. The problem in Japan on nuclear issues is that there is a sharp separation between the nuclear deterrence community and the nuclear disarmament community, and they don't talk to each other. That is something that eventually needs to be changed a little bit, in the sense that this distance between the two communities and animosity, rivalry between the two is a little bit of a problem for Japan, I think. But at the same time, it also reflects the contrast between not being a nuclear power and having all that history with Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but at the same time also relying on the US nuclear umbrella. So I think it's a interesting combination of the three non-nuclear principles, but also the four pillars of nuclear policy of Japan. And one more thing I would like to add is that the third principle, do not allow nuclear weapons to enter Japanese territory, has always been a little bit of a loose principle. Some experts in Japan wonder how, in a contingency, Japan can reconcile that principle with coordination with the US on the nuclear level. Or they also argue that the third principle could undermine the nuclear umbrella in peacetime. So I think that kind of debate is alive. We're going to see a lot more debate on the third principle of the non-nuclear principles, but I personally don't believe Japan will nuclearize anytime soon.
Yasuaki and Jennifer, did you have anything you wanted to add?
In fact, I graduated at Hiroshima University, and I think that Japanese public opinion has a strong feeling to oppose the nuclear weapons. So the focus of nuclear issue for post-Japan was the three non-nuclear principles: don't make, don't have, and don't allow to be brought into Japan. American nuclear weapon should not be in place on Japanese soil. But I think that was only a part. The Prime Minister Sato Eisaku proposed non-nuclear principles. But at the same time, Sato Eisaku get a commitment from US of the extended deterrence for Japan. Originally, three non-nuclear principles and extended deterrence was set. Under today's international security environment, public opinion gradually accepting Japan and the United States must also discuss nuclear strategy and deepen share the understanding.
And Jennifer?
I would echo the previous views and say I don't think it's likely that Japan is going to take this move anytime soon. But I think it's important to understand that it could. It's possible that someday it may do that. A lot of people tend to emphasize Japan having a nuclear allergy and the strength of public opinion against it, which is true. These are all very legitimate points if you look at poll data that people are not in favor of this. But I would also point out, for decades, Japanese leaders have periodically visited the question of whether or not Japan needs to acquire its own nuclear weapons. And over time, they have also consistently affirmed that they could do this legally within Japanese law, within the Constitution. They've said that nuclear weapons are defensive weapons, meaning that they would be allowed under Article 9. And then in terms of technological hurdles, Japan has the fissile material, right? It's got tons and tons of reprocessed plutonium. It's a global leader in space technologies, right? So it clearly has the scientific and technological capabilities to do this. As I said, I agree that I don't think Japan is actually serious about this right now. It's natural to be discussing this at times of heightened threat. And again, but between the progress that North Korea has made in its own nuclear arsenal and missile technologies, between China's nuclear modernization, it's natural that Japan might be thinking about, does our existing policy of relying on the US extended deterrence, does that continue to serve our interests? I think, again, the South Korea case, as Sayuri said, they're much more serious. They're much more advanced in their conversation. And I think it's because their situation is much more dire. They have doubts about the credibility of the US nuclear umbrella, which is to some extent related to Trump and changes in US politics and so on. But I would say much more so related to North Korea's emerging intercontinental capability. Because from the US standpoint, the costs of defending South Korea have just increased 1,000-fold. If North Korea can retaliate against the US homeland with nuclear weapons. This is putting American cities, millions of American lives at risk. We have to remember when this happened within NATO in the 1960s, when the Soviets developed an intercontinental capability, it caused a major crisis in the alliance. The way that crisis was resolved was France elected to get its own nuclear weapons, and other countries' moves in this direction were stopped, were placated by the US creating this nuclear sharing program. So South Korea might choose either of those directions, and it should not be surprising to anyone. As for Japan, again, its situation is quite different. It does not face the North Korean threat to the same extent that South Korea does. And another thing I would point out is the United States is quite focused on its security competition with China. And when you look at these two allies, South Korea is not an ally against China. South Korea is a US ally against North Korea, and it has made very clear it wants to keep that alliance as narrow as it possibly can, and it is not interested in at least a wider security, hard security alliance. It's, of course, interested in many partnerships and technological cooperation and human security initiatives and so on, but South Korea is not interested in containing China. So that's a major problem in the US-South Korea alliance. Japan does not have that problem. Japan is worried about China. China is Japan's key security focus, just like China is for the US. And so there's a real compatibility of strategic priorities here between Japan and the United States. And so I think for all these reasons, the US nuclear umbrella remains pretty credible in Japan's eyes. Its leaders probably won't want to pay these costs that Sayuri was talking about before. And so, again, I don't believe Japan's going to make moves toward acquiring its own nuclear weapons at this time.
We could go on for hours, I think, talking about this, but in the interest of time, we have to move to our Japan memo questions, which we ask all our guests. Hugely looking forward to what you're going to say to these questions. First question is whether you have any book recommendations for listeners who wish to understand Japan better. And the second question is what you think people often get wrong about Japan. Sayuri, I can see you smiling there, so let's go for you first.
A book to understand Japan. I really thought about this hard, and there's so many good options. And I'm looking forward to Jennifer's new book, that's for sure. I'm going to go with a novel today. I'm a huge fan of mystery and crime, and I'd like to draw attention to Point Zero by Matsumoto Seicho. It's a classic mystery book from the 50s. It's a beautifully written novel on the taboo of Japanese prostitution, catering to GIs during the US post-war occupation. It's set in the 50s. I'm a big fan of Matsumoto Seicho because his book break from the closed room mystery genre that was so popular before the war, and it skillfully combines the mystery and crime part with the social commentary of post-war Japan. And it often has women as main characters, and through their actions and their crimes, you get a fascinating glimpse of what life was like in Japan in that era. What do I think people often get wrong about Japan? This was a very difficult question because I grew up knowing about Japan. So everything was natural and nothing was really surprising to me. So I really struggled with this one. I could say that Japan's defense policy is one, as we talked about. Many people from the outside think that Japan is either a very pacifist country, whatever that means, or it's militarizing very quickly and it's very dangerous. The truth is somewhere in between, it's so much more nuanced. Also, something a little more cultural is that many in the US think that Japan is very high tech, but actually not really, in the sense that of course, technology is advanced, but it is still very difficult as a foreigner to buy tickets online for a lot of things. It's very still low tech, the use of fax machines, of course, but also buying tickets at the train station. There's this contrast between the high tech bullet trains, but also the low tech ticketing system and the relationship that the customer has with the service industry. It's very old fashioned.
I saw my first ever fax machine in Japan. I'd never seen one before until the 80s. And I think I may see my last ever fax machine also in Japan because they're still surviving in various little outposts of fax. Good points. Thank you, Sayuri. Jennifer.
I think because we're in this moment of the 80th anniversary of World War II, I was thinking a lot about books to give perspective on that. Last year, I reviewed Gary Bass's book on the Tokyo trials. It's called Judgment at Tokyo, and it's truly wonderful. It's a bit formidable in how big it is, but it really is a fantastic book that needed to be written, provides wonderful perspectives on this unbelievably complex event that we still struggle with how to think about. And I also really recommend historian John Dower's work on Japan's World War II experience. It's a historical memory of that. War Without Mercy. So there's just wonderful books on really important themes with respect to World War II that go much beyond just the strategic chess game and the military operations, much more about who we are as humans and how the war changes us. When I think about what people get wrong about Japan, I completely endorse what Sayuri said. I also confront cartoonish views of Japan in many cases. I think what I would say as a security specialist who works on Japan, I find that there are sort of two different frames for when we think about Japanese security policy. One of the frames is we look at what Japan is doing today and we compare that to what Japan has done in the past. I think when we use that frame, for example, we talked about defense spending earlier or various capabilities that Japan is acquiring. So if you use that frame, you say, wow, Japan spent 1% of GDP on defense for so many years, and that was seen as sort of this sacred figure that Japan should not exceed. And the fact that they have exceeded it, they're talking about going to 2%, that's a very big deal. And again, so that frame of Japan at T1 versus Japan at T2 would say, look at how extraordinary this progress is, and let's focus on all the internal changes that have made this possible. And that's a completely fascinating and viable conversation, an important conversation. But I think what's often missing is the second frame, which is to compare Japan to other countries, other potential great powers in the world, and to historic great powers. There you get a really different picture. So there you say, Japan spends 1.6% of GDP on defense. What are we talking about? That's nothing. Even if they do go up to 2%, which they may not, but even if they do, that's below the global average. Yet Japan is this country that, as we've talked about, faces a dire security threat from a proximate superpower that is fanning anti-Japanese nationalism and has designs on Japanese territory. So that means this is this giant puzzle that we need to figure out. How on earth is a country in that situation, given how international politics normally operates? How is it spending so little? So again, the first view points us to a really interesting set of questions and historical evolution. But I think very often missing in the conversation is that second view, which is looking at Japan as a potential great power that is choosing to not be a great military power, and to raise questions about why that might be.
Thank you, Jennifer. And Yasuaki, as you're sitting in Japan, I think, give you the last word.
I recommend 日本の防衛政策 Japan's Defense Policy, written by Mr. Sugimoto Koji, who is a journalist of Sankei Shimbun newspaper. This book was just published 2 months before. And this book investigates Japan's post-Cold War security policy with a particular focus on Abe administration's strategies behind the scenes process of drafting the 3 security documents as we discussed today. Backed by extensive interviews with key figures, it can be considered definitive work on the subject, and I highly recommend it.
Well, definitive work is great praise indeed. Thank you for that. And what do you think people get wrong?
Japan is often accused of free riding on security, but I believe this is a misconception. In the late 1960s, when the Nixon doctrine raised doubt about US commitment, Japan ensured a minimum level of defense capability through its National Defense Program guidelines. It's also accepted the burden of hosting US bases, particularly in Okinawa. And during the global war on terror in the 2000s, as Dr. Romei mentioned, Japan dispatched the self-defense forces. recent increase in defense spending is a part of a continuing effort rooted in these past actions.
Thank you. A perfect way to conclude. So thank you so much, Yasuaki, Jennifer, and Sayuri, for a really detail-packed, rich discussion. Really, I shall go through the transcript again and again and take new things away each time I read it, I'm sure. So thank you so much. To our audience, please do follow our wonderful guests on their various social media accounts. Details of how to find them will be in the show notes. Thank you again, as always, to our listeners for joining us on another episode of Japan Memo. If you have any comments or feedback, please contact us by email at japanchair, all one word, at iiss.org. And if you enjoyed this episode, please do subscribe to Japan Memo on the podcast platform of your choice. And for more insightful analysis, I also encourage you to look at past research from the Japan Chair Programme at the IISS and the broader IISS on our website. Thank you again, wonderful guests, and thank you, listeners, for your time, and see you next time. Goodbye.